The anime begins by showing a thrilling scene as a group of heavily armed soldiers is deployed to capture a boy named Kazuyuma, who is on the run. He races towards Sigusha Park, determined to escape capture. The soldiers, including skilled snipers, struggle to take him down as he is constantly moving and evading their bullets. The situation becomes dire as all roads around the park have been closed off to avoid any civilian casualties due to Yuma's powerful and destructive attacks. As Yuma continues his desperate sprint, his vision begins to blur, and he feels a strange sensation in his right hand. Suddenly, his hand transforms into a giant, creature-like being with colored orbs that shoot out and destroy anything they touch. Just as Yuma is surrounded by the armed forces, a costumed figure named Insania intervenes, using his water powers to attack the troops. However, their respite is short-lived as two cyborgs appear and cripple Insania. But all hope is not lost as Akatsuki Yuriko, also known as Yuri, quickly comes to Insania's aid. Together, they manage to take out the troops and blow up their aircraft, forcing the leader of the troops, Kamishiro Genji, to order a retreat. The next day, Mitsuchi Kwan is seen taking a nap under a tree. Soon after, Ryomanji Te arrives to check on Kwan's condition, as he had used Insania's powers in the rescue operation the night before. Kwan reassures Te that he is fine, and also expresses relief that Yuma's condition has stabilized in the hospital. Not wanting to waste the day, Kwan decides to take a walk and get some fresh air. As he walks, he comes across a young man named Tako, who runs a stall in the courtyard of the fantasy garden. Tako scolds Kwan for always putting himself in danger to protect others, but Kwan remains steadfast in his beliefs, choosing to prioritize the safety of others. As Kwan continues on his journey, he runs into Yuri, who complains about her bruises sustained from the previous night's rescue operation. However, Kwan brushes off her complaints, continuing on his way. Meanwhile, Kiri Jogasaki is daydreaming on a bridge. Kwan eventually comes across her, offering her a listening ear and a safe place to express her feelings. Kwan approaches Kiri and asks her to play the music box that she always carries with her. As they begin to talk, Yuri and Miyamisaki spot them and Yuri becomes upset, dragging Kwan away from the bridge. As they depart, Kwan senses that Kiri's power is overflowing, and suspects that she may be experiencing a resurgence of power, similar to what happened with Yuma. Meanwhile, back at Kustos headquarters, the weapon terminators of Kustos are getting repairs after their duties from the previous night. Suddenly, a notification comes in on the communication screen at the base, reporting the whereabouts of an escaped Insanian target, and ordering the cyborgs to arrest them. As the cyborg leader, Cyborg Alpha, and a new cyborg Epsilon prepare to take on the task, they remember the failed mission from the night before, which resulted in the destruction of 3 cyborg units, and a meeting with Genji, the leader of their troops, to discuss the next step. When Genji confronts Epsilon about the failure of the previous night's mission, Epsilon explains that it was his first mission, and he was nervous while carrying it out. Genji reminds him that cyborgs are created to achieve perfection, and warns him not to make mistakes on his next mission. Following this, Epsilon receives system improvements from the chief technology of Kustos, Takahiro, to enhance his performance. Kwan later visits Yuma in the hospital, who has regained consciousness. Kwan informs Yuma of the enormity of his power, and that he will be wearing a bracelet to suppress it. The doctor in charge of his treatment, Wakatsuki Midori, also mentions that Yuma will have to train to control his power. Yuma seems uncertain that he will be able to control the power within himself, but Kwan reassures him that there are many people in that place who have powers similar to his and that with hard work and determination, he can learn to control them. Kwan then urges Yuma not to give up and not to use his power for evil. At night, Kiri is shown delivering medicine to her grandmother, Saori, who has been unwell. After taking care of Saori, Kiri returns to her room and reflects on her childhood memories. She looks at a picture of herself as a child, singing with her late parents. Despite her singing talent, she has been unable to sing since the fire that killed her parents, and has been unable to shake off the trauma of that event. Kiri lives with her grandmother now. As she reflects on her past, her power re-emerges as she starts singing. Her singing was detected by the WDOC team's radar that targets people with monster power. Genji immediately orders his team to make an arrest, but Kiri stops singing and her power disappears before they can locate her. Genji then calls off the arrest operation as Kiri's whereabouts are no longer traceable. Kwan, who had been in the vicinity out of concern for Kiri's safety, also decides to leave. The next morning, Kiri wakes up and prepares breakfast for her grandmother, Saori, as she is now unable to move around on her own. Saori tells Kiri to take some time to have fun outside of the house and not to spend all her time feeling down in the house. As lunchtime approaches, Kiri says goodbye to her grandmother and heads to the fantasy garden. Her presence in the park surprises her friend Miu, who quickly tells her other friends, and they all give Kiri a warm welcome and treat. Yuri joins Kiri and takes her around the park, showing her different sights and attractions. Meanwhile, Midori finishes examining Yuma's strength and finds that he can make his skin harden. They eventually meet up with Kwan at a cherry tree, where the three of them get to know each other and talk. As the day comes to a close, Kiri returns home but is shocked to find her grandmother unconscious in her room. She quickly calls for an ambulance to take her to the hospital. After Saori wakes up, she tells Kiri that she will be able to sing and speak again just like she used to. Overcome with emotion, Kiri tries singing and her powers return. Meanwhile, Yuma is having nightmares that trigger his power to rise again. The bracelet that suppresses his power is destroyed, and he fears that he will hurt someone, so he chooses to escape from the room. In the hospital, Kiri continues to sing and miraculously revives Saori, who had passed away, bringing Kiri great happiness and relief. As for Yuma, he is now wandering in a park, holding his right hand, which has started to transform into a Goliath-like creature with red orbs again. At Kustos headquarters, Genji detects the simultaneous powers of Yuma and Kiri and immediately orders his troops to capture them. At the same time, an active signal of their powers is also detected at Kwan's headquarters and his allies, leading Kwan to prepare to save them both. Tako expresses his concerns, trying to remind Kwan that he cannot save both of them at the same time, and urges him to choose one to save. However, Kwan remains determined to save both of them, and as he walks out of the base, he declares that his determination to save everyone will never change. As he sets out, Kwan activates his powers and transforms into Insania before heading toward the location where Yuma and Kiri are. After learning that her grandmother's condition has stabilized and feeling happy, Kiri decides to go home. On her way, she sees that the road to her house is blocked and is directed to take another route. In the park, Yuma tries to hide behind trees as he sees Kustos troops surrounding the area. Kiri also sees two cyborgs who are closing in on her at the end of the road she is on. She is then rescued by Yuri, who quickly takes her away from the street and hides her in a safer place. Yuri explains to Kiri that the cyborgs were after her because she has monster powers in her voice. Soon after, Yuri contacts Tae at their headquarters and invites Kiri to hide in a building. Kiri becomes curious about Yuri's group and their goal of saving her. Yuri explains that she and her friends are Attractors, people who possess powers like Kiri, and they strive to protect everyone who has monster powers like them. Meanwhile, Insania meets and tries to calm Yuma, who continues to release red orbs, causing Insania to become injured in the process. But by the time Yuma manages to control his power, Kustos forces have already surrounded them, forcing Insania to fight the cyborgs in his injured state. Tako, worried for Insania's safety, decides to go to the fight site and teleport Insania and Yuma's bodies to another place. At the building where Yuri and Kiri are hiding, the cyborgs almost capture them, but Insania and his group arrive in time to fight off the WDOC forces. At first, Insania dominates the fight, but due to the large number of cyborgs he is facing, he becomes overwhelmed and is eventually cornered. Seeing the fight from afar, Yuma becomes angry and releases the red orbs again to attack the Kustos army and save Insania. The orbs set off the building's fire alarm, causing the Kustos troops to withdraw to avoid any further involvement with the Japanese government. After the fight, the Attractors gather on a bridge to wait for their comrades to come and pick them up. Tako scolds Kwan again for thinking that he can save everyone by himself. Kwan agrees and thanks Tako for coming to his aid. He also thanks Yuma for being able to control his powers. Kiri then reveals that she doesn't know what to do next. Kwan reassures her that she has become part of a group of Attractors that will help save people who have powers like theirs. Soon after, Ryo and Miu arrive to pick them up and everyone gets into the car. One day, a serial murderer begins to strike the city and always leaves a pattern that resembles a flower, painted using the victim's blood. Kwan investigates the case, suspecting that the murders are related to the rise of someone's power. Along with Kwan, Epsilon and Delta also investigate the case by going directly to the crime scenes to analyze the floral patterns. A few days later, as Kiri and Saori were walking together in a playground, Kiri sees a boy named Karu trampling on a flower. Kiri immediately approaches him to stop him, but Karu does not seem to care about her warning and walks away from the park. Kiri decides to continue her journey to the fantasy garden to train her strength alongside Yuri, but she still struggles to completely control her power. Meanwhile, Kwan continues to investigate the murder cases that occur almost every night, with the perpetrator leaving almost the same flower pattern. The next day, Kiri meets Karu again, who is trampling on flowers in the playground, and Kiri tries to ask him about the reasons for his actions, but Karu does not want to give any explanation and decides to leave the park. In the evening, the leader of the Ordo group, tasked with exterminating anyone who possesses the power of monsters, asks Genji to send the cyborgs to solve the serial murder case that has occurred. After Genji assigns the task to his troops, they immediately begin their investigation and accidentally encounter a girl with monster powers who attacks them. Quan, who becomes aware of the situation, rushes to the scene, but like Insania, he is unable to save the girl and she is killed by the cyborg army. As the cyborgs are about to attack Insania, the leader at the headquarters orders them to withdraw as they have other tasks that need to be completed. On the other hand, Quan is filled with guilt because he was unable to protect the girl. Moments later, Epsilon and Delta arrived at the scene of the serial murder and begin to study the flower pattern the perpetrator had drawn. After completing the identification process, they learn that the serial killer was the girl they had just killed after she went on a rampage after being exposed to hallucinations caused by a plant. They then try to find the plant that caused the hallucination effect for further identification, suspecting that it was someone's monster power. The next day, Kiri meets Karu again, who is sitting on a swing while enjoying the beauty of the flowers in the garden. Kiri takes Karu to the Fantasium garden so that he can see more flowers in bloom. Arriving at the flower garden, Karu seems very happy to be able to see the healthy flowers, unlike those in the playground. He is curious about who takes care of the flower plants in Fantasium garden, and Tate tells him it is Quan who planted and took care of all of the flower plants. Karu praises Quan's ability because he can make all the flowers in the garden happy. Karu reveals that he can understand the language of flowers and that he trampled on the flowers in the playground the other day because the flowers felt unhappy and asked him to kill them. Because of this power, he was bullied since childhood by his friends who considered him strange. After recalling his dark past, Karu suddenly leaves Fantasium garden to tend to a mysterious flower plant that he had planted in the garden area of Fantasium garden with the intent to kill everyone. At the same time, Tako and Miyu, who are investigating Karu, arrive at his house and find many flower plants, one of which releases poison and knocks Tako unconscious. Meanwhile, not long after Karu's departure, a mysterious giant flower plant rampages through the Fantasium garden causing panic among visitors as they all flee the garden area. Kiri is shocked, and her powers surge, nearly injuring those around her, but luckily Yuri comes to destroy the monster plant and immediately calms Kiri, albeit sustaining injuries. Quan was in for a shock when he arrived at Karu's house. The once familiar home had been overrun by a giant flower monster that had consumed his friend, Tako. Without hesitation, Quan transformed into Insania, his powerful alter ego, and set out to attack Karu in an attempt to save Tako. But Karu was not an easy enemy to defeat. Possessing rapid healing abilities, Quan's every strike seemed to have no effect. The monstrous plant continued to grow, and Quan struggled to keep up as it mutated into an even larger form. Meanwhile, Kustos' team, aware of the emergence of the monstrous creature, dispatched an army of cyborgs to destroy Karu. As Karu continued to grow into an even more terrifying creature, Insania fought to stop him, determined not to harm him. However, the cyborgs, with their advanced weapons and technology, launched relentless attacks that ultimately led to the crushing of the monster plants, causing Karu to be thrown to the ground. Amidst the chaos, Tako was finally freed from the monster and fell to the ground unconscious. But their troubles were far from over. A giant monster plant, even larger than Karu, appeared not far from his home, and the power within it fully awakened. Meanwhile, Miyu rushed to save Tako and brought him to a safer place. Insania and the cyborgs turned their attention to the new threat, but it was clear that this monster was more powerful than Karu had ever been. With its powerful tendrils, it attacked Insania and the cyborgs relentlessly. Insania, despite his best efforts, was quickly bound by the monster's tendrils. Just when all hope seemed lost, one of the cyborgs fired a deadly shot that burned the plant monster's body until it was destroyed and Karu was thrown to the ground. Quan, now back in his human form, desperately reached out for Karu's hand, but it was too late. Karu looked up at him with a sorrowful expression and said, "It's alright, I don't care if I die. No one cares about me anyways." With those words, Karu passed away. Quan felt a deep sadness and grief wash over him as he realized that he had failed to save his friend. The cyborgs were shocked at the sight of Quan's grief, having never considered that the monsters they fought against might have feelings. Back at the hospital, Mia sat sadly by Tako's bedside. Her dog had died during the battle, hit by the rubble of a building as Karu's monster attacked. Kiri, not wanting to see her friend in such a state, sang a magical song that brought Mia's dog back to life and restored its health. The once sad Mia was now beaming with joy as she hugged her beloved pet. Afterward, Kiri headed to the garden around the sakura tree to accompany Quan, who was planting a flowering plant that he had saved from Karu's house. 10 years ago, before he was transformed into a cyborg, Epsilon was known as Kazami Shun, a young man with a loving sister named Misa. One night, Shun took Misa to a local night market to play games and have fun. But as they were enjoying themselves, the night market suddenly caught fire, and Shun was forced to quickly search for a way out. Unfortunately, as he was searching for his sister, he came across Misa in the grip of a terrifying monster. In a desperate attempt to save her, Shun fought the creature, but ultimately he was unable to save Misa and was himself gravely injured. Now, as Epsilon, Shun wakes up from a nightmare of that tragic night, with the memory of that past event still etched in his mind. His colleague Takahiro, who is examining him, is surprised to find that Epsilon, now a cyborg, is still capable of having human-like dreams. He is also shocked to learn that Epsilon still retains some of his memories from before the transformation. Suddenly, the alarm at Kustov's headquarters sounded, signaling the detection of a monster revival. Epsilon quickly arms himself, determined to put an end to the creature's threat, his past haunting his every step as he moves to engage the monster in battle. In a narrow alley, Epsilon manages to knock out a girl who is beginning to turn into a monster. But his victory is short-lived as Insania arrives, ready to fight Epsilon in order to secure the girl. Tae and Yuri quickly move to take the girl to safety. Just as they thought the fight was over, another cyborg arrives and attacks Insania, taking advantage of the distraction. Seizing the moment, Epsilon rushes to kill the monster. But the fight takes a dramatic turn as Tae, feeling cornered and desperate, suddenly shouted and unleashed a burst of bright light that rendered everyone present unconscious. After the fight, Kwan and the others take the unconscious Tae to the hospital at Fantasium Garden. As they arrive, several small children waiting outside the nursing home seemed anxious about Tae's condition. Kwan immediately reassured them, telling them that Tae was being taken care of by Midori, and asked them to return to their respective rooms. Midori examined Tae's brainwaves and discovered that she was in a dreaming phase. Meanwhile, Epsilon was also still unconscious and Takahiro discovered that he too was in a system that allowed him to dream. Takahiro was confused by this and tried to understand what had happened to Epsilon. He discovered that Epsilon had collapsed after making contact with one of his targets. He explained that this condition was unfavorable for Epsilon and that it was likely that he could not be saved, as his brain would experience prolonged stress. Midori also said the same thing about Tae's condition, who was still unconscious. The team was worried about their friends and colleagues. They would do whatever they could to help them. Meanwhile, in Tae's dream, she found herself in a dark and confusing room. Suddenly, hundreds of lanterns appeared and Tae planned to escape from this mysterious place, but her steps stalled as she saw Epsilon. In the real world, Tae's body convulsed as she experienced this dream. Yuri tried to hold Tae's body to keep her from hurting herself, but unfortunately, she was also exposed to Tae's power, causing her to have flashbacks of her bad memories from the past. Yuri struggled to overcome these memories, but was ultimately able to do so, without getting hurt. Kwan and the others begin to suspect that Tae's powers have gotten out of control, as she suddenly unleashed her power to attract the emotions of her target, and used them as weapons to mess with the target's mind. At Kustal's headquarters, Takahiro explains to Genji that they can save Epsilon by erasing his memory, but that it would turn him into an ordinary combat robot. Genji, despite the loss of Epsilon as a cyborg, orders Takahiro to proceed with the procedure. Takahiro begins to erase Epsilon's memory, but unexpectedly, Epsilon cancels the process on his own. Takahiro is surprised by this and examines Epsilon further, discovering that there is a brain pattern of Tae being caught in Epsilon's dream wave. Genji realizes that the brain systems of Epsilon and Tae are connected and that through this connection, they may be able to find the location of the Attractors' headquarters and access various information through Tae's memory. Despite the risk that the brainwave link search could cause Epsilon to never wake up again, Genji decides to proceed with it, as it could provide them with valuable information about the Attractors. He asks Takahiro to find a way to take advantage of this connection to gather information and locate the Attractors. At the same time, Ryo, who is responsible for the security system at the headquarters, receives an urgent warning that there are intruders trying to track their location through Tae's brainwaves. He immediately asks Midori to sever Tae's brainwaves from Epsilon's, even though it would put Tae's life in danger. Midori warns him of the risks of such an action, and Kanazuki suggests finding other ways to buy time and prevent the intruders from tracking down the Attractors' headquarters. Takahiro, who was still at the Kustos headquarters, looked surprised as the infiltration process he was performing on Epsilon suddenly stopped. He realized that the Attractors must have become aware of their actions, and that they would have to find a new strategy to continue their search. At the Fantasy Garden, Mi delivers some of Tae's brainwave data to Ryo, which he plans to use to outsmart the intruders by sending them fake brainwave data. In this way, they can mislead the intruders and prevent them from getting access to Tae's real brainwaves. Meanwhile, Kwan comes to visit a boy named Yutaka who had been rescued by Tae. Kwan suspects that Yutaka may be connected to Tae's subconscious and decides to enter Yutaka's subconscious in order to connect with Tae and save everyone. Kanazuki warns him that this is risky and could put Kwan's safety in danger, but Kwan is determined to save his friends and holds Yutaka's body to connect with Tei's telepathic system. Back at Custos headquarters, Takahiro has discovered several locations of the Attractors headquarters in various countries, which confounds the Custos team as they try to determine the original location of the Attractors. Seeing the memory of Tei's past, Kwan questioned her about it. He implored her to realize that she had been deceived by Shun's fabricated memories. But Tei refused to listen and sought refuge in the image of Shun, whom she perceived as a brother figure. Shun, too, was determined to protect Tei and preserve the illusion of their familial bond. But just as he was shielding her, Shun's body suddenly transformed into that of a cyborg known as Epsilon. The revelation was a shock to Tei, and she let out a blood-curdling scream. In that moment, a beam of light enveloped Tei, and she was nowhere to be seen. After the incident with Tei, Kwan expressed his surprise to Epsilon, revealing that he had been unaware that cyborgs like him possessed memories of the past. But Epsilon was unresponsive to Kwan's surprise and instead inquired about the existence of Misa. Kwan then accused Epsilon of fabricating the events that had just transpired. This made Epsilon angry and he launched an attack on Kwan. Suddenly, the place around them was consumed in a raging inferno. The flames grew larger and engulfed Kwan's body. But amidst the blaze, he saw a mysterious figure standing behind the flames. Not long after, Kwan wakes up to find himself back in his past, lying under a tree. He is awoken by his younger brother, Toa, and the two of them quickly rush home. Along the way, they come across a man who is injured. Toa, with his powerful healing abilities, quickly mends the man's wounds. However, the man is frightened by Toa's powers and runs away. Kwan reminds Toa not to use his powers carelessly as it could put his safety in danger if the villagers were to find out about his abilities. Toa explains that he only wants to help those in need. The two of them then continue on their way, and as they do, a dazzling light appears. Meanwhile, at the Attractors headquarters, Ryo updates Kanazuki on the enemy's progress. They've managed to successfully destroy some of Tei's fake brainwaves, and Ryo reminds them to find a way to sever Tei's brainwaves as soon as possible before the enemy can locate the original brainwaves. While Kwan is still trapped in his past memories, he finds himself in a new location, where a boy is warning him to help the villagers who are preparing for an event. Suddenly, Kwan is transported to another past where his entire village is in flames. He sees a mysterious figure, who claims to have defeated him. Upon hearing this, Kwan finally realizes that he is in an illusory world. The same light that had appeared before engulfs him once more, and he finds himself back in the memory where Toa wakes him up, just as before. Knowing that it was all an illusion, Kwan runs through a crack in a tree and finds himself in an empty space. Frustrated at being trapped in his past memories, Kwan sets out to find the creator of the illusion. Meanwhile, Shun and Tei continue to enjoy each other's company at the night market, until Kwan emerges from behind a tree and tries to remind them that they are all in an illusion. Shun is skeptical of Kwan's claims and decides to take Tei away, but at that moment the surroundings shatter like broken glass and the three of them are sucked into a vacuum. At the same time, Yuri, who is outside the base, is nearly captured by the Custos forces when Tako appears to rescue her, teleporting her to another location. Kwan and the others find themselves adrift in the void, and shortly after, they all have a glimpse of their dark pasts. Shun remembers the fire and massacre that occurred at the night market, while Kwan witnesses himself turning into a monster and slaughtering his fellow villagers. To their surprise, everyone in the base also sees a glimpse of Kwan's horrifying past, leaving them all in shock. Subconsciously, Kwan and the others come to understand who they truly are, and Tei returns to her adult form. Shortly thereafter, the three of them are thrown into Yutaka's memory, and they discover that Yutaka is the mysterious figure behind the illusion. The figure reveals that he wants to be a hero who punishes all sinners. Tei calmly tries to persuade the figure to reveal his true identity, and eventually the figure transforms back into Yutaka. They are all then thrown out of that place. At the same time, Shun has a glimpse of the past when he remembers the night market, and how Misa had turned into a monster and begged for help. Kwan and Tei come to realize that the link of their brainwaves had been severed, foiling the Custos attempts to locate the Attractors headquarters. Meanwhile, the Custos forces continue to pursue Yuri and a depleted Tako, who is unable to teleport. The two of them take a rest under a tree but are soon surrounded by the Custos army. Luckily, Insania arrives to protect Yuri and Tako and becomes the target of the Custos forces. Insania, in a fit of rage, defeats the entire army. Back at Phantasium Garden, Yutaka wakes up and is warmly welcomed by the Attractors. Meanwhile, Yuma, who had seen Kwan's past, approaches Kwan, who is healing from his wounds under a sakura tree. When Yuma asks about it, Kwan confirms the reality of his past. The next day, the children in Fantasy Garden, including Yuma, are talking about Kwan's past actions, causing conflicts among them. One night, Kwon meets with Yuma, who held a grudge against him and calmly apologizes for his past actions. He assures Yuma that he will always protect him, and Yuma finally forgives Kwon. After forgiving Kwon decided to take a walk alone in the city to clear his mind. Meanwhile, Tae, worried about Kwon, searched for him throughout the city. She was confronted by a group of thugs and frightened, causing her to unconsciously release the power of her mind, causing the people around her to turn on each other. The Custos group detects the presence of a monster force in the city, and quickly sends Epsilon and his comrades to eliminate Tae. Just as Tae was about to be attacked, Kwon, who had transformed into Insania, intervenes and blocks the attack. Epsilon sees Tae's face clearly and remembers his dark past. This causes his body to start burning, and he is racked with pain. Genji orders Epsilon to be killed, knowing that he will turn into a monster. But, unfortunately for Genji, his plan fails, as Insania and Tae manage to rescue Epsilon just before Custos forces are able to shoot him. When Epsilon regains consciousness, he finds himself at the Attractors' headquarters in Phantasium Garden, and realizes he has sustained serious injuries. Kwon comes to visit him and suggests that he call Epsilon by his human name, Shun. Kwon also offers for Shun to stay at the Fantasy Garden, but Midori disagrees with this idea. All of the Attractors meet to discuss this and ultimately decide that Shun can stay at their base. In the evening, after being shown around the park by Tae, Shun decides to leave as he feels it is not appropriate for him to stay, considering his past. Meanwhile, at the Custos headquarters, Takahiro manages to track the location of the Attractors' headquarters in Phantasium Garden through a tracking device implanted on Epsilon's body. As Shun is walking away from the Fantasy Garden, his body is suddenly remotely controlled by the Custos group to return to the Attractors' headquarters and launch an attack along with other cyborgs that have been programmed to do the same. Insania and his friends battle against the troops sent by the Custos group. Under the control of the Custos group, Shun is ordered to kill Yuma once again, but his actions are blocked by Tae, causing him to remember his past upon seeing her face. Shun's body begins to burn, and he transforms into a monster, attacking the cyborgs. At the same time, Delta, who has the upper hand against Insania, shoots Insania in the stomach and head, causing him to collapse on the ground. After causing destruction, the cyborgs are ordered to retreat. As Shun rushes to Insania's side, a missile is launched and destroys the area surrounding Fantasy Garden. After the incident, Genji is summoned by a member of the Ministry of Government, as the Custos attack on the Phantasium Garden has resulted in a major incident. Genji defends himself by saying that everything he did had been approved by the head of the Ordo. However, he continues to receive strong criticism for all the offensive actions that could potentially endanger the Japanese government. Meanwhile, those who lived in Fantasy Garden manage to escape the explosion that destroys their headquarters, and they are all making their way to a safer hideout. Yuma remembers how he, Yuri, and Tako had survived the explosion. Tako teleported them and he created a giant bubble that protected them from the devastating explosion. Tae is worried about Kwon and Shun, who did not have the time to escape when the explosion occurred, but Yuri reassures her that they must be fine. The next day, the leader of the Ordo sends researchers to examine the ruins of Fantasy Garden. As one of the researchers is searching through the rubble, Shun suddenly appears and attacks him. Shun disguises himself in the researcher's clothes and manages to escape from the area. The news of Shun's escape also reaches Takahiro, leaving him shocked that Shun was able to survive the devastating explosion. Later, at night, the Attractors arrive at Kanazuki's acquaintance's house and all the children are exhausted and fall asleep immediately in the room. Yuri and Tae then meet with Kanazuki, who is talking with an old woman named Sanada on the terrace. Kanazuki introduces her as one of the people who played an important role in the construction of the Phantasium Garden. He then leaves to gather information about the enemy's movements. Sometime later, while Genji is tracking down the Attractors, Kanazuki, who has been tidying up his appearance, comes in as a city councilor to ask some questions related to Genji's attack on Phantasium Garden. Genji explains that the explosion did not kill any of the Attractors, but he is pleased to have destroyed their hiding place. He also adds that he believes Insania has been burned to death in the blast, although he did not find his body. Kanazuki continues to press Genji for answers and finally asks if Ordo has realized that the hideout they attacked was empty, leaving Genji speechless. Genji then attempts to pressure Kanazuki by bringing up the parent company of the Phantasium Garden, which is owned by Kanazuki. It is then that Genji realizes that Kanazuki is one of his enemies. Not long after, Genji asks his guards to come and points a gun at Kanazuki. On the other hand, Shun is surrounded by Custos forces after they have tracked down his whereabouts, so he kills the troops. At the same time, Delta appears and asks Shun to stop his actions. Shun tries to remind Delta to stop making arrests against the Attractors because everyone who has the power of monsters is just like ordinary humans. Delta ignores Shun's words and tries to capture him, so the two of them fight. When Delta manages to corner Shun, he breaks through the wall behind him and escapes. Meanwhile, Tae and Kiri, who have just met Saori, are being chased by the Custos group on the road, so they both decide to enter the waterways to escape. Unfortunately, the Custos group manages to follow them into the waterways and they are both cornered. Fortunately, Shun arrives and manages to rescue Tae and Kiri from capture. After his strength recovers, Kwon wakes up and is shocked to see Toa inside a red crystal. At the same time, Kanazuki, who managed to escape the attack of Genji's men, goes to a room to deactivate all the systems in the Custos headquarters, using the special access he has. Kanazuki then hacks into the Fantasy Garden dungeon system and sees that Kwon has regained consciousness, and promptly asks Kwon to leave the room immediately to avoid being caught by Custos forces. Kwon, furious after finding Toa inside the crystal, rejects the request and accuses Kanazuki of hiding Toa. Kanazuki finally decides to go to the basement to explain what happened to Kwon, but Kwon, who is extremely angry, transforms into Insania and attacks Kanazuki. Kanazuki, who has fallen due to the attack, is still trying to explain the truth to Insania, but he is unable to continue his explanation after Genji and his men arrive. As Insania prepares to fight, Genji calmly explains that he did not order a cyborg to attack him, but they all attacked Insania's friends at Sanada's house. Kwon rushes to Sanada's house after hearing that all of his friends are in danger. After Kwon leaves the dungeon, Genji forces Kanazuki to tell him about the red crystal in the room. As the cyborgs descended upon Sanada's house, a fierce battle erupted. Meanwhile, Kanazuki finally revealed the truth about the little boy trapped inside the red crystal. It was Toa, a child with immense power rivaling that of even Kwon, his older brother. With the potential to destroy the world, Toa had sealed himself away 1,000 years ago to prevent his power from causing harm. As Kanazuki finished his tale, he made plans to blow up the entire place, but Genji had other ideas. With his own extraordinary powers, he summoned a small whirlwind that plucked the explosive device from Kanazuki's hand. Kanazuki watched in shock as Genji revealed that he possessed the secret power to steal other people's abilities. On the other hand, Insania arrived at Sanada's house and quickly joined forces with Shun to defeat the cyborgs. But as the dust began to settle, Genji, now in possession of Toa, made his sudden and unexpected appearance. Using his newly acquired strength, he had covered the distance from the Fantasy Garden dungeon to Sanada's house in an instant, much to the surprise of everyone present. Genji called for all cyborgs to retreat, and ordered them to attack Sanada until she was unconscious, while he confined Insania and Shun in a box to prevent them from attacking him. He then explained that he had captured the monsters to protect them all and urged them to join him in his quest for safety. Tako, intrigued by Genji's offer, decided to follow him. As Tae lay unconscious, Genji and those who had decided to join him set off, leaving behind the chaos and destruction of the battle. With Genji gone, the barrier box that had confined Insania and Shun was also destroyed, freeing them from their imprisonment. Moments later, Kanazuki also arrived, seeking to explain the cause of the conflict to Kwon. In ancient times, the people of Kwon village who possessed powers were dwindling in numbers and were becoming a minority, causing friction with the normal citizens. Kwon and Toa, feeling out of place, decided to leave and live in the forest. One day, a group of people came to attack the village. Toa, fearing that his power could harm innocent people, chose to seal himself away, while Kwon, consumed by anger, transformed into Insania and slaughtered the invading army. With a newfound understanding of the past, Kwon and his friends began to devise a plan to save Tae and the others who had been captured by Genji. As a first step, Ryo hacked into the security systems at Custos headquarters to give Kwon and his companions a way to infiltrate the base. Meanwhile, Takahiro was still trying to resurrect Toa through Tae, but his attempts had been unsuccessful as Toa refused to be resurrected. But when Takahiro and Genji learned of the intrusion, they ordered the cyborgs to kill the intruders, setting the stage for a final confrontation. Meanwhile, Shun was engaged in a battle against the cyborgs, including Delta, whom he was trying to convince to join their side. Unfortunately, as Shun attempted to bring Delta to safety, a cyborg stabbed him in the back. In a selfless act of bravery, Delta sacrificed herself to protect Shun from another fatal blow. Meanwhile, Yuri and Yuma stumbled upon Tako and the other children who had joined Genji. Initially resistant to the idea of leaving, Tako eventually managed to convince Yuri, and the group used his teleportation powers to escape the base. At the same time, Kwon, utilizing Insania's powers, encountered Genji in the room where Toa was being held. Genji, who had absorbed the powers of many other monsters, attacked Insania with overwhelming strength, managing to absorb his powers, and becoming a powerful being in the process. As the Ordo activates the demolition of the headquarters, chaos ensues as everyone panics, trying to find a way out as the exits are closed. Meanwhile, Yuri and the others rush to Tei's room, determined to save her. As Tei wakes up, she contacts Ryo, and using her telepathic powers, she guides everyone to safety, giving clues to the way out as the base starts to disintegrate. They begin to move forward but soon find themselves facing a dead end. But Shun, using the last of his strength, destroys it, and the group is able to move forward. Genji, who also possesses superpowers, continues to fight Quan even after they have escaped the base, turning his men into monsters to attack Quan. Quan, despite being at a disadvantage, continues to fight, determined to put an end to Genji's reign of terror. In a final act of desperation, Quan reaches out and takes hold of Genji's hand, and enters his consciousness. There, he meets Toa, who lends him power, enabling Quan to defeat Genji and bring out all the power that Genji has taken. The anime concludes by showing the aftermath of the Ordo blowing up their headquarters and the police arriving on the scene to make rescues and arrest the remaining members of the organization. It also shows the team, Quan and others, who have saved the world and their friends. The moral of the series is the consequences of greed and arrogance. The Ordo organization, led by Genji, was driven by their desire for power and control, ultimately leading to their downfall. True strength comes from the bonds of friendship and the willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. When we put the needs of others before our own desires, we can accomplish great things, and true happiness can be found in helping others.